You think you can just drag me out of this car? You have no idea who I am." Tasha Johnson's voice was calm, but the anger simmering just beneath the surface was palpable. The sun was high in the sky, a warm spring day in the city, the streets bustling with life. But all of that was lost on Officer Lucas Hale, who had his hands wrapped around Tasha's arm, pulling her from her vehicle. His eyes burned with an intensity that made it clear he wasn't concerned with the details of the situation. To him, she was just another black woman he could push around without consequence. He yanked her out of the car with no explanation, no warning, just the force of his authority. People in the street stopped and stared, but no one stepped in. The world seemed to go still as Tasha found herself dragged across the pavement. But she didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She just stood tall, her expression unreadable. Officer Hale, irritated by her lack of resistance, barked commands at her. "What do you think you're doing here? Are you lost, or just trying to cause trouble?" His words were laced with derision, meant to put her in her place. But Tasha wasn't listening. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the call she had to make. Hale could feel the crowd's eyes on him, but it wasn't enough to make him stop. He had the power. He had the authority. Or so he thought. "You better speak up, lady," he said, pulling her forward roughly. Tasha didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She simply raised her phone, pressing the screen to dial a number. As the phone rang, she glanced around, taking in the faces of those watching. It was almost as if she were in a different world, one where she had control and not him. The phone call was answered. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "I'm being detained by Officer Lucas Hale. You might want to get down here." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Hale froze, the blood draining from his face. He had no idea who he was messing with. He'd never heard her use that tone before. She wasn't just some random person he could bully. She wasn't just a woman on the street, helpless and powerless. She wasn't just anyone. Her husband was Ethan Johnson, the chief of police. And now, as the seconds ticked by, Hale's smug expression began to falter. The moment he realized who he was dealing with was the moment everything shifted. Tasha stood there, not moving, not reacting, her phone still in her hand, waiting for her husband's arrival. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. People shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another as the realization began to sink in. The officer's demeanor changed slightly, his grip loosening, but the damage had already been done. His entire sense of control was slipping away. He had no idea how deeply he had just stepped into a situation he couldn't handle. Just moments before, he had been sure that his authority overpowered everything. Now, as he waited, he started to wonder if he had misjudged things. The sirens in the distance grew louder, the sound of approaching justice. Tasha didn't break her stance. She didn't even look back as the sound of her husband's car grew louder, closer. Hale glanced nervously down the street, the walls of his confidence crumbling bit by bit. And when Ethan Johnson arrived, stepping out of the car with the calm authority that only a police chief could possess, everything fell into place. Ethan's eyes locked with Hale's. The officer stammered, trying to explain, but the words came out wrong. "I didn't mean. I thought she." Hale's voice trailed off, failing to find a reasonable excuse for his actions. "Step aside, Officer Hale," Ethan said, his voice low but powerful. His gaze was sharp, unyielding. Tasha was his wife, and no one was going to treat her like this. Hale hesitated for a moment, but the weight of Ethan's position was undeniable. He stepped back, stumbling slightly, his hands raised in a gesture of reluctant surrender. "I didn't know," he muttered, but it was too late. The damage was done. Tasha stepped forward, her posture relaxed now that she knew everything was under control. She stood next to Ethan, her eyes meeting Hale's once more, but this time, it was different. The anger had melted away, replaced by the quiet assurance of someone who had been wronged but was no longer powerless. "I hope you've learned something today, Officer Hale," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You don't know everyone you come across, and you don't always get to decide who's beneath you." With that, the scene dissolved into the background of the city, the crowd going back to their business as if nothing had happened. But Hale knew better now. The power he had once wielded with such ease had vanished in an instant. And as Ethan and Tasha walked away, side by side, they left him standing there, alone, with the bitter taste of karma slowly sinking in. "I thought it was over, but it was only just beginning," Ethan Johnson stood beside his wife, Tasha, his jaw clenched as he watched Officer Lucas Hale retreat, his pride and confidence completely shattered. The air around them felt different now, charged with a quiet tension that only those who understood real power could feel. The officers in the area, who had been standing around, exchanging idle chatter moments before, now stood in stunned silence, their gazes shifting uncomfortably between Ethan and Tasha. Ethan could sense their unease, their awareness of just how easily the balance of power had shifted. He glanced at Tasha, who stood tall, her calm composure unshaken by the public humiliation she had just endured. Her eyes were fixed ahead, and she didn't look back at Hale, not even for a moment. "Let's go," Ethan said softly, his voice low but commanding. They walked side by side, the crowd parting slightly to let them through. Tasha's footsteps were measured, purposeful, as if nothing had happened. But Ethan knew better. He could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface of her cool exterior. As they reached their car, Ethan opened the door for her, his movements precise and deliberate. The tension that had filled the air moments before seemed to fade, but it was far from over. Inside the car, Ethan finally turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tender, a stark contrast to the harsh tone he had used just moments ago. Tasha met his gaze, her lips curling into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady, but there was a certain edge to it that he knew. "Well," Ethan started the car, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his mind still processing the events that had just unfolded. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He was used to handling matters of the law, but this was different. This was personal. "You know, I never thought I'd have to see something like that," Tasha continued, her tone now a bit more reflective. "But I'm not surprised. It's always the same. They think they can get away with it, just because of the color of my skin." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he heard her words, the anger rising in his chest once again. "It's not right," he said, his voice sharp. "No one should have to experience that, especially not you." Tasha looked out the window, watching the familiar cityscape pass by, her expression distant. "It happens all the time, Ethan. It's not just about me. It's about every black person who's ever been treated like that. Every person who's been looked down on, judged before they even open their mouths. It's about the system that allows it to happen." Ethan's silence spoke volumes. He didn't have all the answers. He couldn't change everything in one day, but he could make sure that the people who treated Tasha that way would face consequences. He would make sure of it. As they neared their home, the weight of the moment began to settle. Tasha had endured so much over the years, and yet she never let it break her. He admired her strength, her resilience, but at that moment, he could see how tired she was, how much it had all taken out of her. He pulled into the driveway and put the car in park, but neither of them moved right away. "You know, I'm not sure I could have kept it together like you did," he said after a long pause. Tasha turned to him, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I didn't have a choice," she said simply. "It's what we do, Ethan. We keep going, even when they think they've broken us. Because they can't." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't know how she did it, how she kept fighting when everything seemed stacked against her. But he was glad she did. She was his partner, not just in marriage, but in life, and he would never let her face this alone. As they walked inside, Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A text message from an unknown number. She opened it, reading the words carefully. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. There are always more of us." Tasha's expression darkened as she read the message, but she didn't say anything. She simply set the phone down on the counter and walked into the living room, her mind clearly somewhere else. Ethan watched her for a moment, then followed her inside. He knew this fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just starting. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But neither did the people who had tried to bring Tasha down today. They hadn't realized yet that the real power didn't lie in a badge or a uniform. It lay in the people who would always stand up, no matter the odds. And they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. It had been a long night, but the silence that filled their home now felt heavy, like the calm before the storm. Ethan sat in the kitchen, his fingers tapping gently against the table, his mind still racing from everything that had happened earlier. Tasha had stepped outside for a moment, needing some air after the intensity of the day. He understood. She was always the strong one, the calm in the storm, but even she had her breaking points. He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath, letting the weight of the day settle around him. He had spent years in law enforcement, seen the worst of human nature, but nothing had prepared him for what he had witnessed today. Nothing had prepared him for the way Tasha had handled herself, the way she had faced down Officer Lucas Hale without flinching. His heart swelled with pride, but it was quickly followed by the sharp sting of guilt. He hadn't been there when she needed him the most. She had been alone in that moment, fighting not just for herself, but for something much bigger. He knew it wasn't just about the incident with Hale. It was about a lifetime of injustice, a lifetime of people like her being treated as if they didn't matter. He understood the fight, even if he couldn't fully understand the pain. He wasn't black. He didn't experience the world the way she did. But he would never let her face it alone. A soft knock at the door broke him from his thoughts. He stood up, his senses alert, knowing it wasn't just a visitor. It was too late for that. He moved toward the door, his hand resting on the knob for a moment before he opened it. Standing on the other side was a figure he hadn't expected. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that seemed a little too formal for the time of night. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady. But there was a sharpness to it that made the man hesitate for a moment. The man cleared his throat before speaking. "I'm Detective Marcus Hayes. I need to speak with you." Ethan's instincts kicked in immediately, a wave of caution sweeping over him. He had dealt with enough detectives over the years to know when something was off. This wasn't a casual visit. "About what?" Ethan asked, his tone cold now. Detective Hayes didn't flinch. "It's about Officer Hale," he said, his eyes flicking to the side for just a second before meeting Ethan's gaze again. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had expected this to be over. He had thought Hale would face the consequences of his actions, and that would be the end of it. But it seemed the situation was more complicated than that. "Come in," Ethan said, stepping aside to allow Hayes inside. He led the detective into the living room, where Tasha had returned and was sitting on the couch, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw the man standing in their home. "Detective Hayes, what's this about?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Hayes took a seat, his posture rigid, but there was something in his eyes that told Ethan this wasn't a routine visit. "I'm here because we have reason to believe that the situation with Officer Hale is part of a much larger problem," Hayes began, his voice low. "There's a network of corruption within the department, and Hale is just the tip of the iceberg." Tasha's gaze flicked to Ethan, her expression unreadable. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that Hale's actions couldn't have been an isolated incident, but to hear it confirmed like this made the situation all the more real. "What does this have to do with us?" Tasha asked, her tone still steady, but Ethan could hear the edge beneath it. "We believe Hale's actions were not just personal," Hayes continued. "There's a possibility that he was acting under orders, or at least with knowledge of others in the department who have been enabling this kind of behavior for years. We need your help to investigate this." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had always known that corruption ran deep in the system, but to hear it laid out so plainly, to have it brought to their doorstep, it was overwhelming. "What exactly do you need from us?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We need access to the department's internal records, any information you have on Hale's past cases, anything that could tie him to a larger network," Hayes said, his eyes flicking between Ethan and Tasha. "We also need to know if you have any connections within the department who could help us." Ethan looked at Tasha, her face as calm as ever, but he could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was always thinking, always strategizing, even when the situation was at its most intense. "We'll help," she said, her voice resolute. "But we're not doing this alone." Hayes nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to," he said. "This is going to get messy, and we'll need all the support we can get." As the conversation continued, Ethan felt a shift inside him. This wasn't just about protecting Tasha anymore. It wasn't just about one man or one incident. This was about dismantling a system, a network that had been corrupt for far too long. It was a fight he hadn't expected to be part of, but now that he was in it, he wasn't going to back down. As the detective left, promising to contact them soon with more information, Ethan and Tasha sat in the quiet of their home, the weight of what was to come settling in. But as always, they were in this together. and together, they would fight back. It had been days since Detective Marcus Hayes' visit, but the unease in their home still lingered. Ethan could feel it in the way Tasha moved, in the way her eyes would shift when a new message came through on her phone. It was no longer just about the day's events. It was about the fight they had unknowingly stepped into, a fight that was bigger than them, bigger than Officer Hale. Ethan knew that nothing would be the same after today. They were in the midst of something that could shake the very foundation of the department, but that wasn't going to stop them. It couldn't. Tasha had spent too many years fighting injustice to back down now. The two of them, side by side, were ready to take on whatever came next. Tasha sat at the kitchen table, her eyes focused on the documents in front of her. Ethan watched her for a moment before he spoke, his voice low, yet filled with determination. "We're not backing down, Tasha. You know that, right?" She didn't look up, but she nodded. "I know," she said quietly. "But it's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt, everyone who's been pushed aside because they didn't matter to the system. We have to get it right, Ethan. We can't let them win." Ethan felt a surge of pride, mixed with the undeniable weight of the situation. His wife wasn't just a strong woman. She was a force to be reckoned with. And that was why he was going to stand with her no matter what happened next. The days passed in a blur of late-night strategy sessions, phone calls, and carefully planned steps. They had learned more about Hale's connections, about the corruption that ran deeper than they could have imagined. With each new piece of information that came to light, the stakes got higher. The enemy was no longer just Hale. It was an entire system that had allowed his kind of behavior to thrive unchecked. One evening, as they sat in the living room, their phones buzzing with new messages and updates, a thought crossed Ethan's mind. He had always been in control of the situations he faced. He was the chief of police, after all. But this was different. This wasn't about control. This was about justice. And the rules were changing, whether the system liked it or not. "What's next?" he asked, glancing over at Tasha. "We take them down, one by one," she replied, her voice steady, but with a fierceness that Ethan had seen before, but never quite like this. She was ready. They both were. The next morning, they met with Hayes again. He had information, but it was still fragmented. It was a puzzle that had yet to be fully pieced together, but every piece they gathered brought them closer to understanding the extent of the corruption that had festered in the department for so long. "It's bigger than Hale," Hayes said, leaning forward. "Much bigger, and we need to act fast." Tasha didn't hesitate. "We'll do whatever it takes. We need to expose them all." Hayes looked at them, his expression a mix of respect and wariness. "You understand the risks? This isn't going to be easy. People in high places are involved. This could blow back on all of us." Tasha's eyes never wavered. "We're not scared," she said simply. "We've already been through too much. We're not backing down now." Hayes nodded, standing up. "All right, I'll make the calls. You'll get the backup you need." As they left the meeting, Ethan could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. This wasn't just about clearing Hale's name or exposing the corruption in the department. This was about a reckoning, a moment where the system would either change or break. They had already seen how far the department was willing to go to protect its own. But now, with the information they had, they were about to flip the script. The battle was just beginning. Tasha turned to Ethan as they walked to the car, her eyes locked onto his. "We're doing the right thing, right?" she asked, her voice steady but searching. Ethan paused, looking at her for a long moment. He had seen her face this kind of uncertainty before, but this time it was different. "We're doing more than the right thing," he said quietly. "We're doing what needs to be done. For everyone who's ever been hurt by this system." Tasha smiled, her resolve hardening even more. "Then let's get it done." The car ride was quiet, but the air between them was thick with anticipation. They were about to dive deeper into the web of corruption, to expose the truth that had been buried for so long. And as they pulled up to their next destination, Ethan knew one thing for sure. They were no longer fighting just for justice. They were fighting for change. It had been a week since they had started their investigation, and the pressure was beginning to build. Every day, new pieces of information came to light, revealing more and more about the deep-seated corruption within the department. Ethan and Tasha had become experts at juggling their personal lives with the growing demands of the case. Each morning, they woke up to a flurry of messages, each one adding to the complexity of what they were up against. But there was no turning back now. They had made a promise, to themselves and to the countless people who had been let down by the very system that was supposed to protect them. They were going to finish what they had started, no matter the cost. Tasha sat in the living room, her laptop open in front of her, a pile of documents scattered across the coffee table. Ethan walked in, his face tired but determined. He had been on the phone all morning, coordinating with their allies within the department. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were making progress, but with each step, the risks grew higher. "Anything new?" he asked, his voice low. Tasha looked up from the screen, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion that had started to creep in. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. "We've got some key players now. Hill's not acting alone. There's a network, and it goes higher up than we thought. We've got a lot more work ahead of us." Ethan sat down beside her, his gaze flicking to the screen. "How much time do we have?" Tasha took a deep breath, her fingers tapping against the table. "Not much. If we don't act fast, they'll find out we're onto them, and it'll be over. They'll cover it up, just like they've done before." Ethan's mind raced. He had always been in control of situations like this, had always known the next move. But this was different. This wasn't just about doing things by the book. This was about breaking down a system that had been built on lies and corruption. He glanced at Tasha, her calm exterior betraying the storm of emotions he knew she was holding inside. She had been through so much already, and now, with the stakes higher than ever, he couldn't help but worry about the toll it was taking on her. "We'll get them, Tasha," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We have to." She nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I know," she replied, "but this isn't just about us anymore. This is about everyone who's been hurt. Everyone who's suffered because of this system." Ethan reached over, placing his hand on hers. "We'll make it right. I won't let them win." She looked at him, her expression softening for a moment, but the weight of the situation never truly left her face. "Let's do this, then," she said, her voice firm once again. "For everyone who's been let down." The next few days were a whirlwind. Tasha and Ethan continued to gather information, slowly but surely connecting the dots between Hale and the higher-ups in the department. They worked late into the night, going over every document, every phone call, every lead that came their way. They were getting closer, but with each step, they could feel the walls closing in around them. On the fourth night, they received a tip. It was from a source within the department, someone who had been fed up with the corruption and had finally decided to speak out. The message was simple: "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street. I have what you need." The moment they received it, both Ethan and Tasha knew this was the break they'd been waiting for. But there was no time to waste. They had to move quickly. They gathered their things and headed out, the tension between them palpable. As they drove to the location, the silence in the car felt heavy. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything would change. "We're doing the right thing," Tasha said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of uncertainty beneath it. "We are," Ethan replied, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "But we have to be careful. This could be a setup." Tasha didn't respond immediately, but she knew what he meant. They were walking a fine line, and one wrong move could cost them everything. The warehouse came into view, a dark, looming structure that seemed to swallow the light around it. They parked a distance away, making sure not to attract attention. As they approached the entrance, they stayed close to the shadows, their footsteps barely making a sound. Every instinct in Ethan's body told him to be cautious, to keep his guard up. He was used to these situations. He knew how to read people, how to navigate danger. But this was different. The stakes were higher. They reached the door, and Tasha gave him a nod. He opened it slowly, the hinges creaking in the quiet night. Inside, the warehouse was cold, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. But there, standing in the center of the room, was their contact. A man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by a hood. He held out a folder, his hands trembling slightly. "This is everything," he said, his voice low. "This is the evidence you need to bring them down." Ethan took the folder, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This was it, the final piece. But before he could speak, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance caught his attention. He glanced at Tasha, his heart sinking. "We're not alone," he said, his voice sharp. They turned to run, but it was too late. The doors to the warehouse slammed open, and a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Hale, and he wasn't alone. As the doors slammed open, Ethan's heart sank. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light from the streetlights outside, was Officer Lucas Hale. And behind him, a handful of officers, some he recognized, others he did not, stepped into the room. Tasha's gaze flicked between the men, her posture stiffening. Her hand subtly moved to the small of her back, where she carried a weapon, something she rarely used but always kept close. "Did you really think you could get away with this?" Hale's voice echoed in the cold, empty warehouse. There was a sneer in his tone, as if he had already won. Ethan's mind raced. The evidence in his hand felt heavier now, the final piece of a puzzle that was about to shatter. He didn't have to ask. He knew exactly why. They were here. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said, his voice calm, but his eyes never leaving Hale's. "It's over. You can still walk away." Hale chuckled darkly, stepping forward. "Over," he repeated, his eyes cold. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with." His hand shot out, motioning toward the men behind him. "These people didn't come here to be exposed. You're messing with a system that's much bigger than you." Tasha's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she watched Hale. She wasn't scared. She wasn't even flinching. She knew this moment had been coming, but she wasn't about to let them intimidate her. "The truth is already out there," Tasha replied, her voice steady. "You can try to bury it, but it's too late for that." Hale's gaze flicked to her, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, something darker, something dangerous. "You think you're in control, don't you?" Hale said, his words dripping with contempt. "I could ruin you both right here. You're not in charge of anything." Ethan clenched his fists, but he stayed calm. He had heard this before. He knew what Hale was trying to do, threaten them, break their resolve. But they weren't just ordinary people. They had already fought too many battles to be scared of this. "You're the one who's out of control, Hale," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "You've been lying, deceiving, and covering up everything. And now, you're going to pay for it." Hale's eyes narrowed, the tension thickening in the air. "You think the system will let you win? You think the people who've been pulling the strings won't come after you?" He sneered, taking a step forward. "You have no idea how deep this goes." But Tasha stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Hale's, and the power in her gaze was undeniable. "No, you're the one who doesn't understand," she said, her voice like steel. "You think you can keep this under wraps forever? You think people are going to stay quiet after what you've done? We've already won, Hale. It's only a matter of time before everyone knows the truth." For a brief moment, the room was silent, the only sound being the distant hum of the city. Outside, Hale's face twisted in fury, but there was a crack in his armor. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been just moments ago. He glanced at the other officers, who looked uneasy. They had been part of something much bigger, but the truth was starting to seep through the cracks. "You think you can expose all of us?" Hale spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm. "We've already got the proof, Hale. The network you've been hiding behind is crumbling, and there's nowhere for you to run." Hale took a step back, his eyes darting to the men behind him, as if searching for an escape. But the realization was settling in. It was over for him. "You're finished," Tasha added, her voice cold and final. "There's no going back now." The room seemed to hold its breath as Hale's face turned from defiance to panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his tongue. He knew it was over. He had lost. As the officers around him shifted uncomfortably, Tasha and Ethan stood their ground. This wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about bringing justice to those who had been silenced for far too long. And now, as the first cracks in the system began to show, it was time for everything to come to light. The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. It was only a matter of time before the reinforcements arrived, before everything would be exposed. Hale's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him. "You don't understand what you're doing," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But Tasha's gaze didn't waver. "We understand perfectly," she said, her voice unwavering. "And we're not backing down." Ethan looked at the evidence in his hand, the weight of it now making sense. This wasn't just about their fight. It was about everyone who had been hurt by the system, everyone who had been oppressed. And now, they were going to make sure that those who had caused the pain would face the consequences. The sirens grew louder, and Hale's fate was sealed. He had underestimated them, and now he was going to pay the price. The truth would come out, no matter how hard they tried to hide it. This was the beginning of the end for him, and nothing was going to stop them now. The sirens grew louder, the sound of approaching law enforcement now unmistakable in the distance. As they all stood in the dim light of the warehouse, there was an overwhelming sense that something was about to change, something irreversible. Tasha and Ethan were positioned firmly, their stance unwavering, while Officer Hale's face had shifted from defiance to fear. He had no more words. He was no longer the one in control. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he realized he had been played at his own game. Ethan glanced at Tasha, her expression calm, even as the adrenaline coursed through her. She was the picture of determination, resolute in her belief that this was the right thing to do, and that nothing would stop them now. As the sirens reached their peak, the first of the backup officers arrived. The sound of their boots echoed on the concrete floor, and a figure stepped forward from the shadows. Detective Hayes, accompanied by several other trusted officers who had been working behind the scenes. The truth was now becoming undeniable, and the walls around Hale's corruption were crumbling faster than anyone could have imagined. "It's over, Hale," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with finality. "You can't run from this anymore." Hale remained silent, his eyes shifting nervously as he looked at the officers now surrounding him. The power had shifted. His power, which had once been absolute, was now gone. Detective Hayes took a step forward, his gaze locked on Hale, and the tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. "This is it, Hale. We have everything we need. The network's been exposed. You're done," Hayes said, his voice cold and resolute. Hale's gaze darted to the men standing around him, but none of them made a move. The weight of what was happening had settled on all of them. Some had already seen the cracks in the system, but they had been too afraid to speak out. Now, they were caught in the aftermath. There was no going back. "I don't know why you think you can do this," Hale muttered, his voice trembling. "This is bigger than all of you. You're just small pieces in a game you don't even understand." Tasha stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Hale's. "You're the one who never understood," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about you or your connections. This is about the people you've hurt, the people you've tried to silence for so long. And now, they finally have a voice." Ethan stood silently beside her, his hand resting on the folder that held the evidence they had gathered. It was everything they needed to bring down Hale's empire, everything they needed to ensure this system of corruption would no longer be allowed to thrive. "You thought you could hide behind your badge, behind the system, but the truth is always going to find its way out," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "And this time, there's nowhere for you to hide." Hale's face turned pale as the full weight of his situation hit him. The officers around him didn't seem to care anymore. His bravado had worn thin, and he was now nothing more than a man exposed, no longer the feared officer he once was. He had been undone by his own actions, and the people who had turned a blind eye for so long were now watching him fall. Detective Hayes motioned for the officers to move in. There was no need for further words. The evidence spoke for itself, and the law had already spoken. Hale was no longer in control. Tasha and Ethan watched as Hale was led away, his hands cuffed and his future uncertain. For a moment, there was silence in the warehouse, the hum of the sirens in the distance now just a faint echo. The fight was far from over, but this moment felt like a small victory, one that had been years in the making. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been wronged by a system that should have protected them, but had failed instead. As Tasha looked at Ethan, she could see the pride in his eyes, but she also saw the exhaustion. They had fought a long battle, and it wasn't over yet. They still had work to do, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the right path. "We did it," Tasha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture of reassurance. "We did," he replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's not over. Not yet." They both knew the road ahead would be long. There would be more battles to fight, more systems to dismantle. But for now, in this moment, they had won. And that was enough. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. Hale and his network were exposed, and nothing could erase the progress they had made. It was only the beginning. The storm was far from over, but they were ready to face it, together. The days following Hale's arrest were a whirlwind. Tasha and Ethan had barely had time to catch their breath before the next wave of chaos hit. The press was everywhere. The story of the corrupted network they had uncovered spreading faster than they could have imagined. The truth was out, but with it came consequences, some they were prepared for, others they were not. Despite the overwhelming support from the public, the higher-ups in the department weren't happy. Ethan could feel the pressure mounting with each passing day. The phone calls, the meetings, the whispers, everyone seemed to have an opinion on how things should be handled now. But it was different this time. The game had changed. The power had shifted. Tasha sat at the kitchen table, her eyes glued to her phone, scrolling through news reports, her fingers moving quickly, as though trying to outrun the weight of the situation. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. "I know it's overwhelming," he said softly, his voice steady. "But we knew it was going to get messy." Tasha glanced up, her eyes tired but focused. "It's not just the press, Ethan. It's the department. They're not taking this lying down. We've made powerful enemies." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she meant. The fallout from the corruption scandal was far-reaching, and the consequences for their actions weren't over. But they had done the right thing, and he wouldn't let anyone make them feel otherwise. "We can handle it," he said, his voice calm. "We've been through worse. And we're not backing down now." Tasha nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes that she quickly masked. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. She wasn't about to let fear dictate her next move. As the days passed, Ethan and Tasha worked tirelessly, coordinating with allies within the department, gathering more evidence, and preparing for the inevitable backlash that was coming. But it wasn't just the department they were fighting anymore. They were up against a network of corruption that had festered for far too long, and the people who had been complicit were starting to take notice. One evening, as they were reviewing the latest set of files, Tasha's phone rang. She picked it up without looking at the screen, but when she heard the voice on the other end, her entire demeanor shifted. "Tasha," the voice said, a familiar one. "We need to talk." It was Hayes, the detective who had been working alongside them from the beginning. Ethan could see the change in Tasha's expression as she listened, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Hayes rarely called unless there was something serious going on. "What's happened?" Tasha asked, her voice low but controlled. Hayes's response was quick, but it carried the weight of a man who knew they were running out of time. "We've got a leak," he said. "Someone within the department is tipping them off. We're compromised." Tasha's grip on the phone tightened, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Ethan could see the gears turning in her mind. They had been careful, but clearly, someone had been watching them. "How bad?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension in the room. "Bad enough," Hayes replied. "They know we're onto them. We need to act fast. Get the evidence before they can cover it all up." Tasha took a deep breath, her mind racing through their options. She had known the risk when they started this journey. She had known that going after the system meant putting themselves in danger. But she also knew they couldn't back down now, not when they were so close. "We'll meet you tomorrow," she said, her voice firm. "We're not going to let them win." Hayes hesitated, and Tasha could sense the unease in his tone. "Be careful," he said before hanging up. Tasha put the phone down slowly, her thoughts swirling. She turned to Ethan, her face hardening. "We've got to move fast. Whoever's leaking information knows exactly where we are, and we don't have much time." Ethan nodded. He had known it would get worse before it got better, but hearing it confirmed was a different story. "What's the plan?" he asked, already preparing himself for whatever came next. Tasha stood up, her posture strong and determined. "We meet with Hayes tomorrow. We get the rest of the evidence, and we go public, before they can bury it." Ethan didn't hesitate. "We're in this together," he said, his voice resolute. Tasha met his gaze, and for a moment, they stood in silence, knowing that the path ahead was going to be dangerous. But it was a path they would walk together. The stakes were higher than ever now. They had uncovered a web of corruption that reached farther than they could have imagined, and the people who were involved weren't going to let it go without a fight. But Tasha and Ethan were ready for whatever came next. As they prepared for the next phase of their mission, the tension in the air was thick. They knew they couldn't let their guard down. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The night before their meeting with Hayes, Ethan and Tasha barely slept. The weight of everything that had happened and the pressure of what was still to come kept them both awake. It felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. The tension was palpable in their home, a quiet storm brewing in the silence between them. Ethan sat at the edge of their bed, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the wall, lost in thought. Tasha stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of the streetlights outside. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence. Tasha didn't turn around at first, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Of course I do," she said quietly. "But what's the alternative? To stand by and let them get away with it? We've already made the choice. We have to see it through." Ethan nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The choice had already been made, long before they'd walked into that warehouse, long before they'd started digging into the corruption within the department. But the stakes were higher now, and the risk of failure had never felt so real. They were about to step into unknown territory, and there was no turning back. The next morning, they met Hayes at a diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. As they sat down at a booth, Hayes wasted no time getting to the point. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. "The leak we've been dealing with? It's worse than we thought. Someone in the department is feeding them everything we've been working on. They know we're coming for them." Tasha's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "Do we know who it is?" Hayes shook his head. "Not yet, but we're getting close. We've identified a few key players, but whoever it is, they're careful. They know how to cover their tracks." Ethan leaned forward, his mind racing. He had always been able to read people, but this situation was different. They were dealing with shadows, with people who had mastered the art of deception. "What's our move?" he asked. Hayes looked between the two of them, his expression grim. "We go public," he said, his voice firm. "We don't give them time to react. We release everything we have and let the world see what's really been going on. The sooner we expose them, the less time they'll have to bury the truth." Tasha nodded slowly. She knew the risks, but she also knew they were running out of time. "Do it," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We're not backing down." Hayes nodded and stood up, his face set in a hard expression. "I'll make the arrangements. You two stay low for a while. It's going to get ugly." As Hayes walked away, Ethan and Tasha sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do hanging in the air. They had crossed a line now, and there was no turning back. The world was about to find out what had been happening behind closed doors, and there was no telling how far the fallout would reach. But for the first time in a long while, Tasha felt a sense of clarity. They had been fighting for so long, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been wronged. And now, they were finally going to make sure that justice was served. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but filled with resolve. Tasha didn't hesitate. "I've been ready for a long time," she replied. As the day went on, the tension in the air only grew. They knew the storm was coming, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. They had to act, and they had to act now. As night fell, they prepared for the inevitable. They knew there would be no easy way out, but they also knew they were doing the right thing. The system had failed too many people for too long, and now it was time for it to be brought to its knees. When the moment came, it came fast. The world was about to see everything they had uncovered, and there would be no hiding the truth any longer. As the first reports began to surface, Tasha and Ethan watched, knowing that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were on the right side of history. And no matter what happened next, they knew they had won. The truth was finally out, and nothing could change that. The night after the public release was one of the longest they had ever experienced. Ethan and Tasha sat in silence, watching the headlines roll in on the TV and the countless notifications from their phones. News outlets across the country were covering the story, but the intensity of the coverage was more than they had anticipated. The corruption in the department was now exposed, but with that exposure came a wave of scrutiny they could no longer avoid. The phone rang, interrupting the heavy silence that had settled in the room. Tasha grabbed it, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Tasha," Hayes' voice came through, low and urgent. "We've got a problem." The words hit Tasha like a jolt of electricity. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp, her nerves instantly on edge. "They're trying to spin this," Hayes said, his tone betraying a sense of urgency. "They're already calling this a personal vendetta, trying to discredit you both. You need to be ready for the fallout. It's not just the department anymore. There are powerful people involved, and they won't go down without a fight. Tasha's grip tightened on the phone, her expression hardening. "We knew this was coming," she said, her voice steady, though Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders. "We'll handle it." "I hope so," Hayes replied. "But be careful. They're going to come after you. I'll keep you updated." The line went dead, and Tasha placed the phone down gently. Ethan didn't need to ask. He could see the weight of Hayes' words on her. They had known the stakes were high, but hearing it confirmed was a different matter. "It's not over," Tasha said, her voice flat, as though she were trying to prepare herself for the storm ahead. "It's only just beginning." Ethan nodded slowly. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we're doing the right thing, Tasha." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I know," she said softly, "but sometimes doing the right thing means everything's about to change, and not everyone's going to like it." They both sat in the quiet of their living room, each processing the gravity of the situation. Tasha was calm on the outside, but Ethan could see the storm raging beneath her composed exterior. He couldn't help but admire her strength, even though he knew this was taking a toll on her. After everything they had been through, they were now facing the consequences of their actions. They had brought the truth to light, but the battle wasn't over. And now, it seemed, they were on the front lines of a war that had only just begun. The following days were filled with more phone calls, more messages, and more meetings. The pressure was mounting, and as they gathered more information about the network that Hale had been a part of, it became clear just how far-reaching this corruption went. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Ethan could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but he knew there was no turning back. They were already in too deep, and the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. One evening, as they were going over new evidence, Tasha's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen before answering, her expression unreadable. "Tasha," Hayes' voice was urgent again. "We've got intel that they're going to make a move soon. They're trying to erase everything, cover their tracks before it gets any worse." Tasha didn't hesitate. "Where?" she asked, her voice firm. "We're meeting at the old warehouse by the docks. It's the last piece we need to tie everything together." Ethan could see the determination in her eyes. This was it, the final confrontation. They had to act now, before they lost everything they had worked for. "Let's go," Tasha said, standing up without another word. Ethan followed her as they quickly gathered their things and left the house. The air outside was thick with anticipation, the city lights casting long shadows as they drove through the streets. Tasha was focused, her eyes scanning every corner, every street. Ethan knew she was preparing herself for whatever was about to come. He didn't need to say anything. They were both ready. The old warehouse loomed ahead as they pulled up. It was a place they had passed countless times, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, as though something was waiting inside. They parked a short distance away and moved quietly toward the entrance. The only sound was the soft shuffle of their footsteps on the concrete. As they approached the door, Tasha stopped, signaling for Ethan to hold back. She glanced around, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the area. "Something's off," she whispered, barely audible. Ethan felt the same unease settling in his chest. They had been careful up until now, but there was always the possibility that this was a trap. He nodded in agreement, his hand instinctively moving toward his side. They were both armed, but they knew this wasn't going to be a typical exchange. Whatever was inside that warehouse, it was no longer just about the evidence. This was the moment they had been waiting for, and it could change everything. Tasha pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as they entered. The dim light inside revealed a figure standing in the center of the room. It was Hayes, but as they stepped closer, something didn't feel right. Hayes' posture was off. His face, usually calm and steady, was tense, his eyes darting around the room as if he were expecting someone. "We've got company," Hayes said, his voice low and hurried. "They're not far behind." Tasha and Ethan exchanged a glance, both knowing that this moment could define everything. The pieces were finally in place. Now, it was time to finish what they had started. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the stillness as they moved deeper into the dimly lit room. Tasha's eyes were scanning every corner, every shadow, her instincts on high alert. Ethan's mind was racing, processing everything they had learned so far, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Hayes stood in front of them, his posture tense, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "They're close. I don't know how long we can keep them from getting to us." Tasha nodded, her expression hardening. "We need to move fast. This is the final piece. We can't let it slip through our fingers now." Ethan glanced at Tasha, his gaze meeting hers. They had come this far. There was no turning back. The information they had uncovered was the key to bringing down the entire corrupt network, but now, with everything hanging in the balance, they had to act. "What's the plan?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, though the tension in the air was thick. Hayes hesitated for a moment, glancing at the door as if he expected someone to burst through at any second. "We're going to upload everything we have to a secure server. Once it's online, there's no stopping it. The whole world will see what's been happening." Tasha's eyes never left Hayes, her jaw tightening as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice sharp. Hayes looked at them, his expression grave. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here to make sure you get out safely. Once it's done, I'll follow. But you two need to be the ones to finish this." Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was the moment. They had all the pieces. Now, they had to put them together. Tasha moved quickly to the laptop that Hayes had set up in the center of the room. Her fingers flew over the keys, her focus absolute. Ethan stood by the door, his senses heightened, watching for any signs of movement. The silence in the room was deafening, but it only made them more aware of the danger they were in. Every second counted. Tasha's eyes flicked to the screen, a look of determination on her face as she entered the final commands. "It's done," she said quietly, her voice steady. The weight of the moment hung in the air. The evidence was now live, accessible to anyone who wanted to see it. But even as they stood there, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. This was it. There was no going back. The world would now know everything. "We need to go," Hayes said, his voice urgent. "They'll be here any minute." Without another word, Tasha and Ethan turned toward the door, their footsteps quickening as they moved toward the exit. The tension was thick, the air heavy with the knowledge of what they had just unleashed. The truth was out, and with it, the danger they had known was coming. The sound of engines revving in the distance was the first sign they had left it too late. They were too close now to hide. As they reached the door, Tasha glanced over her shoulder, her eyes meeting Hayes's one last time. He gave them a small nod, his expression unreadable. They didn't have time for a goodbye. They didn't need one. The world was already changing. The door to the warehouse slammed open, and Ethan and Tasha stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting them like a wave. The streets were empty, but the city was alive with the buzzing of phones, the flashing of screens. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. But the night was far from over. The battle was just beginning. Ethan glanced at Tasha, his jaw set with determination. "We finished this," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. Tasha nodded, her gaze hardening. "We don't stop until it's over." They didn't need to say anything more. They knew what had to be done, and together, they would see it through to the end. The fight for justice wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they moved swiftly through the streets, the city around them seemed almost indifferent to the storm they had just unleashed. Ethan and Tasha moved in sync, the weight of what they had done settling deeper into their bones with every step. They had exposed the truth. There was no going back now. The world was waking up to the corruption, and the ripple effects were already spreading. They knew the consequences would be far-reaching, but the sense of justice outweighed the fear. Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden sound breaking the silence. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was another message from Hayes. "They're moving faster than we expected. The higher-ups are already scrambling. We need to be ready." Tasha's jaw tightened, and she exchanged a look with Ethan. He could see the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't going to back down, not now. "We'll be ready," she said firmly, her voice steady as always. "We've come too far." They kept walking, their pace quickening as they reached their car. The weight of their mission, of everything they had uncovered, felt like it was pressing down on them from all sides. The system they had fought to expose was trying to fight back, and the stakes were only getting higher. The city streets were a blur as they sped toward their next destination, an underground meeting with the people who had been working with them behind the scenes. Their network was small, but it was loyal. They needed to be more strategic now than ever before. The room was dimly lit when they arrived, the walls lined with old filing cabinets and stacks of documents. It smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Hayes was already there, waiting for them. His face was more serious than usual, his eyes scanning the room as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. "They're getting desperate," he said without preamble as soon as they stepped inside. "We've got to move fast." Tasha and Ethan exchanged a look. They knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. "What's our next move?" Ethan asked, his voice low but determined. Hayes motioned toward the table, where a map of the city was spread out. Pins marked various locations. Some of them familiar, others new. "We've got a few more people to expose, a few more pieces of the puzzle to put together. But the higher-ups are already shifting the narrative. They'll try to discredit everything we've uncovered." Tasha's eyes scanned the map, her mind already working through their options. She knew the pressure was mounting, but she had faced far worse in her career. This was just another battle, and they couldn't afford to lose it. "We can't let them do that," she said quietly. "We need to go public with everything we have. The sooner, the better." Hayes nodded, his face grim. "I agree, but we'll need backup. People we can trust. And we'll have to move fast before they cover their tracks completely." Tasha stood, her resolve hardening. "We'll get the backup we need. It's time to end this." As they moved forward with their plan, the reality of the situation began to settle in. They weren't just up against corrupt officials anymore. They were up against a system that had been in place for years, a system that would do anything to protect itself. But Tasha and Ethan weren't afraid. They had already fought this battle once before, and they knew what they had to do. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about making sure the truth couldn't be hidden again. They spent the next few hours finalizing their plans, ensuring that everything was in place for the next step. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The network they were up against was vast, and they were only beginning to scratch the surface. When the time finally came, they moved swiftly, getting the information into the hands of trusted reporters who would ensure the world saw what was happening. It wasn't long before the story broke wide open. The headlines flashed across screens, the truth finally out for everyone to see. It was a moment of victory, but Tasha knew it wasn't over. Not yet. There was still more work to be done. As the reports flooded in and the public reaction grew louder, the department and those involved in the corruption began to scramble. The storm they had unleashed was only just beginning, and Tasha and Ethan knew they were far from finished. But, for the first time in a long time, they could breathe a little easier. They had done it. The truth had come to light, and nothing would stop them from making sure it stayed there. Tasha looked at Ethan, a rare smile playing at the corner of her lips. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. Ethan nodded, a look of determination still in his eyes. "Yeah, but this is just the beginning. We're not done yet." And together, they prepared for the next fight, knowing that they had already won the hardest battle of all, bringing the truth to light. They had exposed the system's corruption, and no matter what happened next, nothing could take that away from them. As the news of their actions spread, the world seemed to shift beneath Ethan and Tasha's feet. The corruption within the department had been exposed, but the fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The phone calls didn't stop. The media kept calling, each one eager for more details, for more answers. The pressure weighed heavily on them, but they had no choice but to push forward. This was the moment they had been working toward, but it wasn't enough. The network was vast, and even though they had torn down one of the key players, the rest of the system remained intact, hiding in plain sight. Tasha and Ethan had prepared for this. They knew the consequences of what they had done, but that didn't make it any easier. They weren't just fighting to clear their names. They were fighting for the people who had been silenced, for those who had been ignored by a system that was supposed to protect them. The pressure, the scrutiny, the whispers, they were nothing compared to the weight of the lives that had been ruined. Tasha sat at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning through stacks of documents, the weight of their next move heavy on her shoulders. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. "We can't stop," he said softly, breaking the silence that had settled over them. Tasha looked up at him, her face determined but tired. "I know," she replied, "but we have to be smart. We can't expose everything all at once. If we do, they'll bury it. We need to strike at the right moment." Ethan nodded, understanding the strategy. They had to be careful now. The network they were up against wasn't just a few corrupt individuals. It was a machine that had been built to protect itself. Every move had to be calculated. Every piece of evidence needed to be airtight. "We'll do it your way," he said, his voice steady. "But we can't let them get away with this." The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and careful planning. Tasha and Ethan had built a small network of trusted allies who were feeding them information from within the department, but the risks were growing higher. Each piece of evidence they uncovered seemed to lead them to someone else in power, someone who had their own secrets to protect. It wasn't just a few corrupt officers. It was the system itself that had to be dismantled. Every time they thought they had a clear path forward, something or someone would throw them off course. But they couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. On the fourth day after their meeting with Hayes, they gathered in the same dimly lit room, the weight of their next move settling over them. Hayes was there, his expression grim as he laid out the next steps. "We've got the final pieces," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the table where they had laid out the evidence. "But we're not going to be able to do this alone. The public is on our side now, but the department is circling the wagons. We need to expose the entire network, or this will all be for nothing." Tasha leaned forward, her eyes locked on the map in front of her. "Where do we start?" Hayes pointed to several key locations, places they had already uncovered but hadn't acted on yet. "We've got to start at the top. If we can take down the people who are pulling the strings, the rest will follow." Ethan looked at Tasha, his heart pounding in his chest. They had been building to this moment for months, and now it was time to execute the final phase of their plan. "We go public," Tasha said, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's the only way. We need to let everyone see what's happening." Hayes nodded, his eyes hard. "It's dangerous, but I think you're right. Once it's out there, there's no going back." But that's the point. The rest of the meeting was a blur of details. There were phone calls to make, reporters to brief, and pieces of evidence to finalize. They had one shot at this, and it had to count. As the meeting ended, Tasha stood up, her resolve clear. "We do this now," she said. Ethan stood beside her, his hand on the small of her back, his support unwavering. "Now," he agreed. The drive to the location felt like it took hours, the weight of the world on their shoulders. They knew the risks, but they had come too far to stop now. This was the moment that would change everything. When they arrived, everything was in place. The press was already gathered, the story ready to break. Ethan and Tasha stepped out of the car, the flashing lights of the cameras blinding them for a moment. This was the moment of truth. The world was watching, and as they walked toward the podium, their eyes locked with each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done it. The truth was finally out. Now, they had to make sure it stayed out. The next few minutes were a blur as Tasha took the microphone, her voice calm but filled with authority. "We are here today because of the courage of those who refuse to stay silent. We have uncovered a web of corruption that has been allowed to fester for far too long. The people in power who should have protected us failed. But we are here to make sure the truth is heard." Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady and strong. "The fight is far from over, but we're not backing down. Not now, not ever." The crowd erupted into applause, the weight of the moment settling over them. They had done it. The truth had come to light. And nothing, not even the system they had just brought to its knees, could stop them now.